In this video, I'm going to discuss the application of adding entourage and scale figures. But before we jump into that, I want to talk just a little bit about kind of at what stage you add certain elements to an elevation to prepare it for rendering. Now, as I look at this elevation, it's a very, very simple one. It's beautiful, but it's simple. We don't have things like perhaps a pendant light that might come down in this entryway, or sconces on either side that might add lighting. We don't have indications of the risers here that might necessitate a railing. We don't have you know an expression of landscaping or anything like that. And that's okay. Again, this is a very basic elevation, but just keep in mind that if you were going to render this, you wouldn't add those elements in Photoshop necessarily. You would probably draw them first in AutoCAD and then bring them in to render them. So you'd bring them in as line work, and probably you'd create that line work based on whatever the selections of, the pendant light, for example, is going to be. Because we want to get away from this idea that we Photoshop lots of pictures, realistic images into this, because it can start to get that ransom note effect. And in order to counteract that, we'd have to print it out and then add some handwork on top of it to finesse. So just bear in mind that if you're going to add elements to a rendering, bring them in from AutoCAD. Don't try to create sort of this collage of elements in Photoshop, not only because, again, it'll be disjointed from a visual standpoint, but also if things have to be changed, the more you add in, the more you're going to have to redo. So just kind of be aware of that. I'm going to really treat this as a very simple rendering and not overdo the additional elements, even though one could really have fun bringing in, pots and topiaries and, beautiful sconces on either side of these columns. Let's say there's just no end to how much fun we could have with this. But for right now, it came in with very simple line work from AutoCAD. And so we're going to just render what we've been given. So now that we have an understanding of that, I want to talk a little bit about entourage elements. There's two things that I want to bring in here. I want to bring in just a little bit of vegetation to kind of soften this. And I want to bring in a couple of scale figures to give a sense of the size here. Now, I have a few trees and scale figures that are already selected. And so let's go ahead and bring those in. Okay, so you can see a few visual elements here that I've brought in. I've got some vegetation here, and I've got some trees. So we can see this one. I've got a sampling here, and I also have a couple different scale figures as well, and you can see them here. So let's go ahead and start with bringing in the scale figures. Now, the thing that you have to remember with any elements that you're bringing in for entourage or anything within a rendered elevation is that these things are in perspective, right? These are not elevations of children. And so we have to be really, really careful when we bring them in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab these two. And you want to be mindful of your client. So if your client has small children, this would be an appropriate piece of entourage to bring in. If they were, for example, 45 years old and their children were much, grown or in college, it wouldn't be appropriate to bring an element such as this in. But I'm going to imagine that these people have small children. And so I'm going to copy and paste in that layer. So I just did, I created a marquee and did Control C for copy and Control V for paste. And you can see the layer came in right here. This is a great time to bring your attention to the fact that none of my layers have been named. And so I'm going to double click on this right now and add a name for this, which is children. I've named a couple, but someone coming into my file would get pretty mad at me because there's so few named layers here. So what I'm going to do now is go ahead and use my magic wand tool, and I'm going to grab here and hit Control X to see what I get rid of. And you can see here I got rid of almost everything but that little part behind her arm. Now I'm going to move her down a little bit, move them both down. And you can see I'm trying to get their feet to look flat. That's where you can really see if something's in perspective with a scale figure, is to see if their feet are flat. And so it's a little bit hard because they're both in two different positions, right? Because one's running. And I want to get the heel of the little boy on the ground, and then I'm going to cut the rest of their feet off because that's the giveaway that they're in perspective. So I'm going to get rid of those. And you can see here, it's not perfect, but it helps. Then I'm going to hit Control T to transform. Now I'm going to imagine that they're standing on top of the porch, and this door, normally a door is about 7 feet tall, but this one's probably just a little bit taller. So I'm going to make sure that they're scaled down, and I'm going to use the door as the guide. And I'm thinking that they are probably about this tall, about half the size of the door. So maybe between 3 and 4 feet. And then I'm going to hit enter. Now, a couple of things I want to make you aware of now is that they are dark, they're black. And so they pretty much kind of draw your eye straight to them and almost resemble like this black hole. And we don't want that. We want the scale figures to enhance the scene, but essentially, you know, someone looking at this perceives it, and then they go, oh, that's how big the space is. And then they move on and look at the finishes, not the scale figures. We don't want anything to be distracting. So I'm going to bring the opacity of those scale figures down to, like, let's say about 30%. I like them really light like that. Some people do them a little bit darker. I just, you know, I tend to really want them to just kind of go away once you've perceived, you know, once they've given the information that they're intended to give, which is the relative size of the space. Okay, I'm going to also bring in a couple of adults here. I'll bring in this one because it almost looks like they're sort of, you know, maybe arriving to see their house for the first time, and they're dressed casually. You can see they're not in cocktail dresses and suits, but they're going to look really nice within this scene as well. And I'm going to paste them. So you can see they're coming in as layers over other patterns that have been created as a clipping mask. And so things are going to look a little bit funny for just a second. I'm going to scale them down. And I'm going to use the same process. I'm going to put them on the doorstep so I can measure them against the door. And we're going to bring them down. So let's say this fella's maybe 6 feet tall and the lady is maybe, you know, closer to 5 feet. Okay, so same thing here. I'm going to go ahead and pull the white background off of them. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit and fix their feet so that they're not in perspective. And you can see there's a little bit of white still that I need to pull out. And I'm just clicking and hitting Control X, which is cut. And we'll put them kind of almost like they're walking up. Sure would be nice if we had some stairs here, huh? Oh, their feet are in a bad position for me to make this work really nicely. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring them over kind of to the front of the door so that there's a little bit less emphasis on kind of the oddness of the way that their feet look. And it'll be almost, you know, a little bit more distracted because the door and the threshold and things will be in front of them. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, I still have to pull a little bit more of the white here, you can see. And then I just have to mimic the same opacity for my scale figures there. So 30, good. Okay, so you can't see her very well now, so I'm going to pull back out. And I'm going to put the parents back down with the kids over here. And so there's a little bit of an emphasis, because I put the people there, there's a little bit more of an emphasis on that front entryway, which is good. And now we have to think about vegetation. Now, what we have to be careful with the vegetation is we really just want it to add just a little bit of softness to the scene. We don't want there to be, we don't want to overly engineer the way that this looks so that we're trying to make it look like a photograph. It's not a photograph. The trees are not intended to make it look photorealistic. The trees are to give it a sense of scale and just give it a little bit of softness. So let me go ahead and let's take a look at the two trees that I want to use. The first one is this one. And so because it's a funky shape or funny shape and there's a little bit of other trees that are right nearby, I'm going to just use my tool over here and we'll hit Control C to copy it, and then we'll bring it back over to our perspective here and paste. So you can see it's behind these other like clipping masks. And so again, that's why it's looking funny. We can bring it all the way back. We're here. Let me bring it all the way to the front. There it is. All right. And so let's go ahead and pull out the elements that we don't need. Now there's going to be some white left over here, and that's okay. We're not going to overly manipulate this part of the image too much because it's not really, you know, intended to give any more than just an indication of scale. Now you can see here, it looks like a bad ransom note because this is photorealistic and this is obviously digitally rendered. And so we kind of, again, just want to make this go away. So I'm going to name my layer. I'm going to call this small tree. And then I'm going to bring the opacity down so that it just kind of adds a little bit of softness, but goes away. Okay. If you are limited in your ability to obtain images like this that are kind of royalty free and free for you to use, you can also start to duplicate this one and bring in a second tree. I'll show you how to do it. You can also transform these. And so you can see here, I'll move this over. I'll transform it so that it's a little bit smaller. And then you can also stretch it this way. Whoops. If you hit enter, it'll apply the transformation. And then you can also go to, let's see, edit. And I can never remember which one of these is right, but flip horizontal. So see, now it's kind of like mirrored and it's a little bit smaller. And it's the same tree, but it adds kind of the second tree if you don't have the ability to obtain lots of different trees. And so that's a nice little workaround. So there's a couple little trees over there. I'm going to move this one over just a little bit. Okay, and then I want to bring in, there's white back here, which of course isn't necessarily very appropriate. And then the same thing here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring in another kind of vegetation element. And so that one we're going to bring in is right here. Okay, so let's go ahead and Control A, Control C, and then we will bring this into our Georgian model once again, Control V. Okay, now this one we're going to put so that you can see it kind of behind the porticos over there. And I'm going to split this in half because I'm going to use one image on each side and I don't want to stretch it. So we'll do layer via cut, and now I have two. I'm going to move this one over and put it back here, and I'm going to keep this one over here. So getting rid of backgrounds and getting rid of backgrounds here as well. I should name this vegetation left. And we will call this one vegetation right. Okay, again, there's going to be some white. And so what we have to do is try to get this behind this, but not behind the white. And so if we look at our layer down here, you can see it has been separated from the background. So it's always kind of an issue of getting all the layers in the right order, because we've really kind of messed with this thing quite a bit. And so let's start to go ahead and put that back there. You can see it looks pretty good. You can see it behind the balusters. Okay, and there is some white still back there. We can add a layer of blue here, but of course, the first thing that we want to do is move it. You can see the clipping mask? You can see it back there. Now, I'm trying to make sure of a couple of things. I want to make sure that the tree here doesn't extend beyond the elevation, because I want to make sure that I still have some room for my labels. And I also want to make sure that we don't see it back here. So I'm going to do some cutting. And I'm going to change the opacity here, bring it way down. Back here. And so now you can start to see it beyond the clipping mask here that we have created. And if we zoom out a little bit, you can see it's pretty soft, and it just adds a little bit of kind of a sense of scale here, a little bit of softness kind of beyond. You can also add things like, a blue sky if you want to, but I don't want to add a blue sky here because I have to add it all back here, and then it starts to feel like a photograph. And I want to really caution you all to not overly manipulate this image, and to really just try to keep it very, very simple. Okay, so let me go ahead and bring this other vegetation down here, and we'll put it back there. And again, changing the opacity down to 50%. Now, I've seen, you can see here, it's really nice. We're not going to keep it because it's not accurate, but you could see where if we brought in some transparency through some window glass, and we'll do that in another exercise, that it would look really nice out the window. Okay, so all I'm going to do now is just trim that excess on that vegetation. It's back here. Okay, too much. Okay, so now there's just a little bit added. Now, I've even seen renderings where they just have a couple little trees over on one side, and it's very, very subtle. I could go crazy adding beautiful shrubbery and things like that, but I'm not going to. Okay, so now if we zoom out, we can see that there's a little bit of softness added, a little bit of transparency added here. But again, just enough to keep things subtle. I'm going to pull down the opacity just a little bit more in here because they're overlapping. It's creating a little bit more darkness than I want. Okay, good. So we have scale figures, and we have some vegetation added in. And it looks really, really great.